So talking about time, these are some of the key points that I hope I'll cover today. So first, this notion of Maya belief in the cycles of things, which is not like ours. Ours is more astrology. We observe patterns. I mean, people who believe in those things, but even if you don't believe in those things, you actually know them. It's part of the tradition that extends pretty much from the origins of our current concept of time, the Babylonian astronomy. So we have zodiacs and horoscopes, and we're aware of that, whether we believe it or not. It's part of our basic cultural heritage. That does not exist in Mesoamerica. People actually count time, like days of the week. We'll talk about how ancient Maya perceived events within the grand cycles of time. So non-linear presentation of time, basically. And the concepts of time and how rulership was connected to time, and some of the time-related rituals, especially this concept that time-space required continuous renewal. So we'll look at some of those. And finally, I want to conclude by talking about prophecies and how this notion of prophecies merged with the Christian millenarian ideology at the time of the Spanish conquest. And this is something that continues to this day as part of the indigenous cultures in the Maya area. So when we talk about Maya timekeeping, of course, there are things that we have already discussed. So you've seen examples of Maya calendar, the long count, the solar, the 260 day cycle. And it's very important that Maya timekeeping is part of the broader Mesoamerican tradition. Things that people have been doing. It's also important that we're looking at monuments, what kings did, members of the court. But there is a broader tradition of timekeeping. And that tradition existed before, and it still exists today. So this is a Chamula calendar board. This board was used in the 20th century. There's a book about it. This is like a wall calendar that hanged in a communal house of a religious brotherhood or cofradia. So people could consult this chart of the solar calendar when they were deciding when to have fiestas, when to have celebrations. And they made little notes on it. And it basically allowed them to think in terms of the Spanish solar calendar and the way it correlated with their own ritual solar calendar. So it's like a basic calculation tool. And so that is 20th century. These tallies are also 20th century. They were collected by Edward Thompson. They're now in the collection of the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. I suspect he actually used those tallies in transactions with the workers at his hacienda, because in the very short description of these tallies, he says that those were made for payment records. But they don't seem to record quantities of money. They seem to be recording days. And some of them make sense if you think about like month. Average time a person spends working, about 21 days per month. And some of them do have names. So presumably those were personal employment records, like how many days someone worked for an hacienda.
Like tallies days, kind of.
Exactly. So these are very basic timekeeping devices that just people had. They had them in the 20th century, and I bet this is exactly what they had back in the times of the kings, in addition to whatever fancy stuff that was being carved on stone. If we think about how daily timekeeping practices worked, that's how they did it. And it's interesting, some of these sticks, they contain more complex calendrical information. This is a continuous count, and the way it sums up the numbers doesn't make sense if you think about like days of labor on an hacienda. It looks like someone is actually counting solar cycles. So not all of these sticks were probably collected by Edward Thompson, but whoever gave them to him didn't quite explain what they were for. Some of them were for keeping track of labor, and some of them were presumably tracking something else. So this is an ancient Maya temple. I've seen the pictures of that temple before. It's at the site of Naranjo. It's a one-room structure with a frieze depicting local hummingbird deity. There's a priest inside. That priest is putting things on the wall. We don't know why. Maybe sometimes he had too much mushrooms. Sometimes he's in a good mood. But we have his autograph here. His name is recorded on a door jamb. Some funny doodles on the bench. And a lot of graffitis on this wall. And those include counts, lots of counts. And it's very important to keep in mind. It's not like this is the only way for someone to record things. These are presumably moments when he felt like it was very important to mark the passage of time for some reason or the other. And those include cycles of 30, 29, 18. Probably he's counting moons. So these are lunar months. We know they are 29, 28, 30 days. Then he's counting cycles of the Tzolk'in. He goes in 13s, and then he switches to 5s. Remember, these are 13-day weeks, but they're also a cycle of 5 year-bearer days. So he's doing some kind of calculation there. And then he's counting in a cycle of 6 or 5 units, which we don't understand. We don't know what he's counting here. And it's interesting, those must be significant moments when he felt like he really had to put it on a wall and not obvious places. So to write that, and you can see how tiny these marks are. They're less than quarter an inch, tiny, tiny. And in order to write them, he had to stand on a bench, face the wall, face the place where the wall intersects with the vault of the room, and then mark those.
How was he marking?
Just scratching them with something sharp over the paint of the wall. So apparently ruining the paint was okay, as long as it was him doing it. So the important part is that these practices are common inside living spaces. Most Maya rooms, if you enter them, you'll see these kinds of marks people were doing from time to time. Obviously not every day, right? But there were moments when they felt like they had to scratch the walls, suggesting that these counts were essential. And of course, sometimes we have very special rooms like this house. There are multiple publications by Saturno, by his grad student, Franco Rossi, who wrote an entire dissertation about this house. This was some kind of school for Maya calendar priests, or obsidians as they were called. So there are murals, but there's a whole section here right next to the bench where we have an area that was plastered over and over. And there are scribbles, incisions, and paintings of charts, notations, where people essentially kept record of time cycles, but also pretty complex calculations because there are no fractions in Maya math. So in order to connect large cycles or large numbers, you essentially have to come up with like common multipliers. And so you need big numbers that you know can be divided by multiple cycles. So those are used for essentially harmonizing different astronomical cycles, calculations. People were supposed to learn those by heart. So this, for example, is a set of such numbers that you use for basic calculations related, as far as I remember, to moon and maybe Mars cycles. And that's part of the basic lunar table for the full length of the lunar cycle, multiple semesters. So this is more like high-end calculation. In practice, I suspect a lot of Maya daykeepers, as they were called in colonial and modern times, kept a record of days with basic prophecies in the 260-day system. This is from one of the books of Chilam Balam. You've seen that example. A lot of it has to do with agriculture, because that's what people wanted to know, whether or not a specific day was good for beans or for watermelons or planting in general or going for a shopping trip. It seems that a lot of Maya calendar was about very basic answers to rather random questions, which brought in some predictability into otherwise unpredictable nature of our existence. Very much like our notion of Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, except in this case, it's 260 of those. So my notion of timekeeping, and it's very important, no stars or planets or other things inform this decision-making process. They're just counting days. And the same thing applies to deciding under which sign someone is born, under which sign gods are born, when you're supposed to do things. It's kind of very interesting. There are some notions of astronomy and the way it is connected to things in this plane of existence. Say at the end of the solar year, there is a month of 5 evil days when the patrons of the year are essentially switching roles. So it's a moment of lawlessness. That's the time we're not supposed to do anything because you don't know who to talk to. And of course, that applies also to the transition between 20-year cycles and their patron gods. You're not supposed to do anything. You're not supposed to start anything, especially, because basically that venture has no patron. No one has overseen it. It belongs to chaos, so you don't want that. You don't want that. You don't want that risk, basically. We do have occasional images of Maya timekeeping. This is an early classic mural. Unfortunately, it was destroyed within a year after its excavation, perhaps by looters, perhaps by carelessness on the part of the archaeologists who didn't cover it well enough. It's unclear. But what you see is a sequence of days. So whoever is writing it is simply counting the days, very much like this fellow here. And sometimes you see there are comments related to presumably what happened on that day. But you also have to think of it in terms of perhaps prophecies, because if something happened on that day, something similar is going to happen on the same day, next 260-day cycle. And that's very important in terms of how Maya people thought about time. Like it's a notion of repetition. Things happen over and over again. So you keep record of that. And then, colonial period Maya histories are hard to read because they don't present you a linear unfolding of events, but rather they tell you which events happen on which particular 20-year cycle. But of course, they're not talking about one instance of 20 years. They're talking about everything that happened on that particular 20-year cycle. Because from their point of view, that's what really matters as a way of predicting the future. So you know that in that particular 20-year cycle, you have to expect a lot of drought because drought has already happened. There's kind of empirical thing to it, right? It's not like we just came up with the prophecies. No, we know that those things are supposed to happen on that 20-year cycle because they already happened. So these are some of the basic elements of Maya calendar. We looked at all of them. What I want to emphasize is that so far we considered the so-called long count. The cycle of days, months, years, 20s of years, and 400-year cycles. But for the Maya, that long count was a tiny, tiny fraction of the full count of time. We call it the grand long count. We don't know what the classic Maya word for it, of course, was. What is important, though, is this is our usual cycle here. And then everything else are periods of ever-increasing magnitude in the base 20 system. So the largest period is 20 multiplied by 20, 21 times 13. We don't have words in English to describe numbers of that magnitude. It is older than the universe as far as we know. But for the Maya, that's how they thought about the infinity of time. It's a number that is so big that is basically nameless. But it's also important that even though these numbers are very large, there are still cycles of time. Things still repeat. And the day, say, Wanahau is always the day Wanahau. The cartoon of Sewanahau is always the cartoon of Sewanahau. So the idea is that within this infinity of time and ever-increasing cycles of time, there is a pattern. And the pattern of repetition. So as long as you're counting days, as long as you know which 20-year cycle you're in, you're not lost. This is how you would record that massive time frame in which Maya priests thought they were. So this is not for a lay person to know. It's very disconcerting, actually, to think that your existence is tiny. Much tiny, in fact, that we think our existence is in relation to the age of the universe. The Maya priests thought the universe was actually older. And there were multiple universes, of course. That was their take on it. So how does it translate into the way Maya people talked about history? This is a great example. And it is part of the narrative from the temple, the inscriptions at Palenque. The basic premise of the story is that you have an usurper king. He's very successful. He lives a long and productive life. He eventually dies. He leaves some kids behind. Those kids have to explain what happened because they kind of have to come up with a legacy story about their dad, why the regime is legitimate, and they have to explain not only to themselves and to everybody else, but also to the gods, the patron deities. And that's the text that pretty much does it. And it's in the funeral temple of the dead, of their father. And so the text, at some point, goes into the future. So we are in around 700 AD. The text shifts forward by a century and a half. So it says, Ichik utimol talom hoben achpop achtam. Then it may be, ichik in the dative, the pleasing of hearts, or the teasing of hearts. As you can see, the author is not 100% certain that everyone will be happy in a century and a half, but there is that hope. It shall come from the Hoben, from your mat, your throne, presumably talking to God, so perhaps to the deceased father, or he of the mat, he of the throne shall come from Hoben. It's not clear, but there's some kind of prophecy there with some degree of probability. And then the text says, and by the way, in 4,000 years into the future, there'll be this very important anniversary. Now, it may sound like very strange, right? But that's how they do it. They say, well, we're here in a century and a half. We'll celebrate this big anniversary, 400 years. And the next 8,000 years will happen, well, nearly 4,000 years, into the future. Sounds very, very promising. And they use definitive, of course. It shall happen. Of course, time will happen, no matter what. Very convenient. Then the text actually goes back to the accession of the deceased king. And so it lurches back a few thousand years into 615 of our current era. And then it basically says 8 days, 3 months, 12 years since he was born, Kinishana Pakal. Then he tied the headband upon his head, Kinishana Pakal, on the day 5 Lamat 1 mol. Remember that date, 5 Lamat 1 mol. And then the text says, in fact, it happened 8 days, 4 months, and 2 years since it came to pass on day 3 Ahau, 3 Suts, there was a stone seating. So that's the nearest period ending to the time when he became king. So they placed him in a chronology, right? He became king 2 years since the nearest period ending. The larger period ending will happen, several hundred years later in 830. An even larger cycle will complete basically 4,700 something AD. That's not enough for this text. And they say, by the way, this succession happened merely 1 million something years since the first king ever came to power. Just some context here, people. Didn't you know? On that day, the Ichmin became Lord. On the day 1 Manik 10 Kasel.
Wait, are they tying their dynasty back a million years?
No, they don't say that they're related in any way. It just happens to be the first king. This is our king, and this is the first king ever in the previous universe, by the way.
Yes.
But they're not connected. Nobody says they're connected. Just think about these important days in your life, right? The first king ever, our king. The first king ever, our king. Not related, but just to consider the fact. And then, 8 days, 5 months, 10 years 11 times 20 years, 10 times 400 years later, it shall happen. 5 lamat, 1 mole. Remember that future period ending of 8,000 years. It shall happen. Since the accession of our great king. 8 days since the sitting of the stone on Tenahal 13 Yashkin. Then it shall happen. 5 lamat, 1 mole. So what they're saying is, the day of accession of King Kinish Hanapakal is actually going to happen only, 8 days from that great period ending in the future. And I know what they want to say here. Is the king himself going to be reincarnated and he'll be there? Or they're saying they're going to celebrate the anniversary of his accession. Like there'll be like a national holiday in the year 4700 AD. But that's pretty much the idea, right? They say, this is the accession of our king. Day 5 lamat 1 mole. It is just as important as the accession of the first king ever, the great god of Kmin, 1,000,000 years ago. And 4,000 years from now on, when the great cycle of time of 8,000 years is over, that'll be only 8 days from the anniversary of the accession of our king, which presumably people will still be celebrating. So this is my idea of like placement and time. And of course, the underlying theme here is that things happen again, like the day of 5 lamat 1 mole. It will keep happening every 52 years, like clockwork. People will remember the great king, the same way as they remember the first king ever, the Black Mean, for millions of years. So these narratives, they sound weird, right? Because they're not interested in the linear progression of events. That presumably everybody knows. What they're interested in is building these connections between events which connect over large spans of time. Past, present, and of course future, because we're in a cycle. Things will repeat. Now, the term for time that classic Maya texts use is tzaka, literally something that is gathered. And this is my favorite example. It says, this is the tzaka of Kinichta Haltun, that's the name of the king. And he is Winik Tun Tzaka, or Winik Tzaktuna. So he is literally the one who assembled 20 stones. And the Maya word for 20 years is Altun, 20 stones, or Winik Hab, a score of years. And Mesoamerican concept of time is like a bag of precious jewels, or a bundle of sticks. Shumolpili would be the Aztec word for it. Literally a bundle of precious stones. And so this notion of time as something that is assembled, put together, is cross-culturally significant in Mesoamerica. This is an altar, presumably for New Year celebrations at the city of Teotihuacan, in the greatest temple of that city, the Adosada structure of the Temple of the Sun. And it looks like a bundle. This is a early colonial period manuscript that shows us a New Year ritual. People are about to burn bundles of sticks on an altar of a new year. So these are very powerful ideas in Mesoamerica. The time is assembled, put together. Some people hold it. And this is something that everybody's sort of on the same wavelength. They understand each other. And we don't know the extent to which it happens because they share same cultural origins, they're Olmec civilizational, the communication between all these cultures, but we know they have similar ideas about human destiny, calendar, and apparently it extends to how they think about time. These are cartoons, of course, 20-year cycles. They have names, the names in the 260-day calendar because that's their essence. So this is an altar, and it literally has the day on it. That's the day of that 20-year cycle. That's the name of that 20-year cycle. So that's what connects it. That's what connects the offerings of this feeding stone with whatever a supernatural entity is supposed to get them. This is a rare example of, once again, talking about time, about the 20-year cycle. It says, Tiu shlachuna how. Washak lahun ol. On the day 13 Lord, the 18 kumkumant day, was the sitting of the stone, chumtun. Uwuk lahun winikab. It's his 17th katun. Waich intun. Waich winal. There was drought. There was hunger. Tu shlahun tun. In its 13th year. Literally in its 13th stone. So this is one of the few actual references to droughts in the Maya inscriptions that we have. Basically telling that there was drought and hunger in a particular year of the katun. But it's also important that they use stone and tun and hab as both indicating year in this text. Now, Maya kings, of course, claim a special relationship to time. So this is the day Ahau, and this is an image of the king and his spouse, literally as that day, as the embodiment of the day that corresponds to a specific 20-year cycle. If that image were not enough, the artist actually wrote a caption next to these cartouches saying, Ubati lahunahau. It is her image in Tanahau, the name of that day in the 260-day cycle, and the name of that Atun, the name of that Winikap, the 20-year cycle. So this is the queen and this is the king, Yuknom Chen. So they are that. Another great example comes from a temple at the site of Naranjo. Remember that God who lived 1,000,000 years ago? At Naranjo, they thought that was their God. In fact, he was the first king of their dynasty. So everybody mentions that fellow as the first king. At Naranjo, they say, it's the first king of our family, by the way. So they're sort of the greatest claimants to the indigenous nature of their place. They claim that they occupied that spot on the landscape for millions of years. And according to their lore, that's where he lived. It's like everybody says, okay, there was that great king. He lived 1,000,000 years ago. Now they say, yeah, totally. Like that hill. That's where he lived. His house is underneath this temple, by the way. There is, in fact, a structure carved out of bedrock underneath that temple. It's not 1,000,000 years old, of course. In fact, it's not even early pre-classic. It's middle formative, about 500 BC. But those little details, they don't really matter. I mean, what really matters is that there's an ancient temple there. Indeed, very, very ancient. And many generations of Maya lords built over it and ever larger temples. In fact, some of these temples were so bigger than the previous versions that the previous versions ended up completely embedded inside later temples, including monuments still standing in front of them. So this is a temple built around 550 AD, and it is covered by a temple built around 600. And there are still monuments standing. Archaeologists worked in the tunnels. This is my photo. I'm actually scanning this stela. This is my scanner. I'm literally standing on one of these altars because there's no other space. This is an archaeological tunnel that archaeologists, Vilma Fialco and her crew, dug so that they could document basically the first steps of that shrine. So here we are. It's like traveling in time, basically. So we're right there. And this is the king. And he's standing and he's holding a massive fire drill. So that's for making fire. And he is dressed as the sun. He has a belt with a strange creature on it. That corresponds to the images of the stars as these fire gods, Chuaks. The sun that vanquishes stars as it rises seems to be the theme. And we see that, we see those creatures surrounding the theme of the rising sun. Here they are more civil and they're offering first tamales, first bread to the rising sun. Here he already collected them. He only has their heads on the belt. And the particular costume is very significant. That's how the rising sun is dressed. There are many images of that. And the text says, Uba bolonahau kolahau. This is the date of that katun ending, the sixth katun. So they literally say that he is that. They don't say it's his image on that day. It's his image as if he were that day, that 20-year cycle. He is the embodiment of time. Pretty straightforward. And then the text says, then he stone binds on 6 katuns. So he is the embodiment. And then he binds the stone. And presumably the stone that he binds is the stone we see. It's the actual monument. There is in fact a graffiti in his palace that shows him presumably offering blood on the altar in front of that stela. So there was really and you can recognize the altar, the stela, the steps of the temple, and it's only a few hundred meters away from that shrine. And we know it's his palace. They buried it too, just like the temple, his descendants. And we have other images of kings doing the same ritual on that very same day. So here's a king from Karakol at the site of Tsibache where I work. There's no image, just a lintel of a shrine that they built, their version of the same shrine. So different kings across Maya lowlands on that day declared that they were the embodiment of that time, presumably for their respective communities. So there wasn't just one king, but many, of course. And then they say that the king's name is 7 rain gods, 7 Yupats. Then his own name, Achnum Sachchan Knich. His name is the sun that makes things happen in the sky. So he is the sun, even according to his royal name, of course. And he is White Chuen, that's his royal title. And he calls himself Yash Bolon Agbulahau. So you've seen that participles. Agbul means the successor, but here it's 9 successors or endless successors. And he's not just endless successors, he's Yash endless successors. The new Perpetual Dynasty, or perhaps the new King Eternal. It's a very powerful name for someone who presides over a new cycle of time. So it's a new cycle and new eternal kingship. And we see that reference in colonial dictionaries where Bolont Akab is described as perpetual thing. As in Christian translations into Yucatec, when they want to say your soul is eternal, they would say Bolont Akab Bishanesh. Your souls are eternal. Or Bolon Akabil, eternity. So it's not a perfect translation match, but it's the closest that we get to what Bolont Agbulahal means. So eternal lords or eternal dynasty. And this particular fellow is Yash, so he's the new one. He renewed his dynastic placement. And we know why. He's a 12-year-old boy whose family got killed because they didn't want to play ball with the Kanul Empire. And so he's basically a petty ruler who rose to the occasion. And then, of course, he would continue to reign forever and make his kingdom an important regional player. But that still is actually his first monument. He's probably around 16, or sorry, not 16, but he's still less than 20 years old on that monument, maybe 17. So he's still very much a very young man and dealing with some serious political trouble. This is one of his later monuments, and he capitalizes on the theme of renewal. He continues calling himself Yash Bolont Agbulahau, New King Eternal. Here he's actually dressed up as that deity. So he renewed the shrine, he put the stela, and now he becomes Ubahilaan, the living embodiment of that part is eroded, but looking at the photo, it's very clear. He's talking about that founder deity, and he's actually wearing his hat with this kind of weird nose. So he's that god. And he, according to the text, by the time he dedicates the stela, he's responsible for 3 katun endings. So they say that on that day, he stone-bound the 6th katun. On that day, he stone-bound the 7th katun. On that day, he stone-bound the 8 katuns. He is 3 katun or 3 stone-binding person. Ush altuna. The 3 katun lord. Achnum Sach. So he is the lord of 3 20-year cycles. And that's around 594. And he's still not even 60 years old. Because he's still in his 3rd katun of life. he would live on into his 5th katan of life. One of the longest serving Maya rulers ever of all time. So you can also see that he gained some extra weight compared to his childhood, even though you can clearly see that it's not like he was a very slim person to begin with. So this notion of kings is exceeding as lords of time is one of these very basic concepts in Maya religion. Some Bartol murals show kings exceeding on a very peculiar scaffold-like throne with a bundle of reeds. By the time you get into the early classic, the reeds develop a look of an alligator wrapped in reeds. And that continues into the late classic. You see the same bundled alligator. And this is a late post-classic, early colonial Paris codex. It has the same creature placed on a rack representing the sky, and then the Lord of Time seated on it. So Maya lords, they basically claimed a convergence, a concurrence with the patrons of the 20-year cycles. And they exceeded as them. So this, for example, is definitely not the scene of the king's accession to kingship. We know it because of the dates. This is his accession as the Lord of the Katun. So the kings would exceed separately as lords of 20-year cycles. And you can see his footsteps onto basically the time throne. So Maya kings were lords of time. It's interesting that early on, Mayanists thought that Maya rulers were all time priests. Later on, Mayanists thought that Maya rulers were all, skilled politicians going after each other in warfare. It turns out that both were right. Maya kings had accessions and marriages and very much the same amount of politics as everybody else in Asian societies, but they also played this very important role of presiding over periods of time. They had those jobs, and that the concept presumably gave them authority and legitimacy. How can you argue with someone who is the living embodiment of Friday and Monday and Tuesday, as a matter of fact? These are all specific verbs for different time rituals. We've seen them, of course. Closing periods of time is what the kings do. Scattering droplets of incenses and blood is what the kings do. Binding or raising monuments, planting or erecting monuments, that's what kings do. And of course, conjuring gods in the process. These are all very important time rituals you see in the hieroglyphic inscriptions. This is one of my favorite images of a time ritual. Somebody who looks like the immediate ancestor of Deni Trejo. Even the mustache is there. He's a provincial ruler, a warrior, most likely. And he is very much Deni El Trejo style, offering incense in front of an incense burner shaped like the face of the Jago god. There's an altar made out of stone, marked clearly as something that is stony, with some pine wood, a human heart, and a big knife stuck into it, like you can see the handle all the way down. Very Deni Trejo sort of image. Came straight from the set of Machete. And then he's holding the bag with incense, of course. That's the one he's offering. And it says, Uk Altun, right? His stone binding. Or Uk Alautun, perhaps. He binds the stone. Ach Chakwayab Kutim, Ach Yashnil. Male Chakwayab Kutim. Kutim seems to be a family name. He of Yashnil, the place of lovely Katingas. You can see it was a place of lovely Katingas, but the people who ran it were pretty tough. It's a port town and a major fortress guarding the southern reaches of Piedras Negras against his archenemy from Yaxchilan. And so probably someone from Yaxchilan just contributed to the ceremony, perhaps against his will. So that's Maya time rituals. This beautiful monument from Kopani we've seen before, kind of meta stela, actually shows the monument itself in the process of being dedicated. It's still wrapped in cloth with a big stone bundle of cloth on top. So a bound stone. You can see its eyes and nose and mouth. It's a living rock. This is an image from a pottery vessel showing you the same thing. There's a very happy volunteer at peace. Someone with a really mean heart extraction tool just finished the job. There's some incense burner, presumably to do that, right at hand. I don't know what Pat Jaguars and macaws are doing there, but I guess it's not a real show if you don't have those. Kind of gives you a sense of what the big performances in Maya cities were like. That's what people come to see on Sundays, right? Uh, and this person is wearing a representation of a sacrificial bowl, but also a female womb. So you kind of wonder whether this is actually a female priestess or someone impersonating a female deity. And then this fellow seems to be a vulture of some kind, supernatural bird, perhaps the bird of the year, of the Hab bird, which is also partially skeletal. So this is what a Maya ritual, time ritual, was like. And of course, this is how Maya described the monuments. And for a while, Mayans thought that the main metaphor here was agricultural, because the verb is tzachbach, literally to plant, like a tree. And so you go into the Maya studies of the 90s and 80s, and there'll be books like The Forest of Trees, and they're talking about stone monuments because of these metaphors. So here, for example, it's a verb, apaha, but made to look like the syllable pa is driving the syllables ta and ha into the ground. And this is a stele that, once again, looks like something upright, tree-like. Of course, now we know that monuments are not trees. We know it from archaeology and from epigraphy. So in archaeology, we have these middle formative sites, which give us the earliest known archaeological examples of time rituals. And there are essentially two kinds of time rituals about 500 BC. One is putting big rocks in the ground, just like my stone monuments, except these are, of course, plain, they're not carved. And some of them are very roughly hewn, which also seems to be important. They have altars. This is the site of Naranjo, not far from the present-day capital of Guatemala, and the archaeological site of Caminaljuyu, and it has multiple monuments in a row, so presumably every 20 years, or perhaps even more often, they were doing that. So these rituals are very ancient, and this perhaps is the earliest example of the stele and altar ritual that we have in the whole Maya world. Other Maya sites are putting offerings in the ground, and those are often of green celts. And at first, they would be just placed in a layer, in kind of square shape. And the argument by Takeshi Numata and his colleagues is that at first it's some kind of communal event. So everybody's in it together. Each community perhaps brings one of these celts. They all put them. They all participate. It's a very equal affair, right? People are still egalitarian. And they put these layers in the ground. And those layers are not visible once the ceremony is done. But you remember, as a group, you remember that moment when you essentially help the universe going. Then over time, these offerings become more structured. They develop cruciform shapes, the upper and the lower regions. And that's a world, obviously, where some people are more privileged. Once you have higher and low, and left and right and front and back, it means somebody is up front and above, and somebody is behind and below. It also coincides with rather unsettling jewelry depicting trophy heads, for example, and evidence of violence, which of course happens in unequal societies, because there are always people who are not happy with the abandonment of egalitarian society, and there are always individuals who basically use violence to suggest that there's no other option but to submit to the new order of things. This is from the site of Sival, further north, next to the site of Homol, where I work. And this is one of those early late formative, or perhaps late middle formative offerings in which it is already stratified. So we see a cruciform cache with jades, and then water jars placed above it, perhaps to represent the sky, the clouds full of rainwater. So by the time you get into the late formative, these offerings gradually fade away. What replaces them is that also middle formative tradition of putting rocks in the ground. So this is the same shrine at Naranjo where the founding deity lived. That monument in the tunnel that I showed you, this is where that tunnel is. So it's right here. So you go around that stairway, you break into the side of the shrine, and you encounter an earlier stairway eventually on the same central axis of the building. And it still has monuments, also completely buried by the later version of the same shrine. These monuments are plain. They look like just big cells. They're painted red. There's nothing on them. So it seems that at some point in the late formative, the tradition of burying jade celts in the ground is replaced by putting celt-like things above ground. And it starts on the southern coast, places like Naranjo you've seen, and continues into places like Naranjo, different Naranjo in the southern lowlands. And so this becomes the mainstream. Somebody gets the idea of carving those things later. Because you can like put an image of the king, kind of helps, or an important god responsible for the ritual. But that sort of carving idea comes later. And we know that these rocks are celts because that's how they're named. So this is an inscription on a jade celt. And it basically says, Chapat, centipede, sky, celt is the name of thunderstone, Taiwak, the name of the owner. And this is the text on a stela from Copan. It says, Yash in, new sun, stone, celt is the name of the stone, and then home the titles of the king of Copan. So these things are semantically identical. The little green shiny things and the big red things. They're just reincarnation of the same concept. And we know that they're like charging batteries for the universe. Kind of makes sense. You want it to be bigger, right? And also it helps because then everyone can see it. And it seems that the underlying mode of operation changes. One thing is when the entire community is participating, everyone brings a little jade piece, they bury it in the ground, but they all remember because it's all theirs. In the new version of the system, it's the people who are real professionals do this kind of stuff. And everybody else can just watch, or perhaps they cannot even watch. But then later on, they can see the material expression of what the professionals did for you.
Oh, this is what our tax dollars go to.
Exactly. This is what your tax dollars are going to, guys. There was no point burying them because then no one can see those tax dollars. And since no one is allowed to do really dangerous, professional things, like an average Joe cannot fly into space, right? You need all that training to be able to do really dangerous magical things with the gods. People are born into those kinds of jobs. That's why they learn writing. And they become Tach priests, senior Tach priests. And so those are, of course, hallmarks of a more hierarchical society. And yes, people still want to know what they spend their money on. So, as you have monuments. So monuments, of course, celebrate time. And they describe this relationship between the monuments and sort of the universe. So this is Stela 40 from Tikal. And those monuments often use the term atich, which is kind of weird because it literally means to bath. So here, the king presumably baths all of those gods. So the 13th hop close, the 13th year closes, and then all of these gods are presumably bathed by the king. And then the stele is planted, and the altar takes shapes. And this is the king, Anak. Now, bathing is like what is going on here. Probably what they're talking about is not like washing, but more like sweat bath. We know that sanctuaries of temples are often described as sweat bath. Because a sweat bath is a place where you get charged not just physically, but spiritually. That heat, it actually replenishes your spiritual heat. And that is a belief still shared by Maya today. Sweat baths are healing places today. You go there not because of the physical sweating, but because your soul gets better too from all that heat. So the temples are pibnas, and of course, this image actually also describes visiting a sweat bath. So in this case, the sun is emerging from the maw of the earth goddess in a mountain. And we know that this is related to that because sweat baths can actually be in the shape of this creature. We know it once again from Shultun. This is a sweat bath from Shultun, an article by Mary Clark came just last year, and that was her dissertation project, excavating and studying that building. And it literally is shaped like the earth goddess. like this, partially merged with the old creation goddess. She has jaguar paws and jaguar head. This is the site of Yasha, where they actually worshipped that goddess. So they literally depict themselves standing in her mouth. And we know it's her because her name is recorded in the head. And if you approach one of the major architectural groups at Yasha, the whole foundation, the massive platform, you see her body on that platform. 10 feet tall, massive stucco facade. Inside that Swadbath, presumably when they enclosed, when they terminated that building ritually, when it ceased functioning, there are offerings of children and frogs. She's the goddess of childbirth, death, and frogs.
Frogs,
or toads.
They like hang out in the mud.
Exactly, because toads in Central America, they hibernate. They go into the ground, they can sleep for years sometimes, or months, and then they emerge. So yes, it's a powerful symbol of rebirth, like death and rebirth. And so that's what happens to the time and the gods, right? That's why they're bathed. They're recharged with spiritual energy. And the important part here is that they weaken as the time passes. They half diminish. This text from Tikal makes it very clear that all of these gods, they half diminish. As in the middle of the Katun, 8,000 terrestrial gods, the solar gods, the serpent, the water gods, they all are diminished. The ancestors, the eternal kings are diminished. So presumably that's why recharging is essential. That's why all these offerings are essential, so that the time keeps going. And this metaphor of rebirth and supporting this cosmic cycle for ritual action is very important. This altar actually compares the death of the sun, the rebirth of the sun after the solstices, to the birth and death and rebirth of the king. This monument, there are actually several of those at the site of Copan between the first and the second kings. That's when they commissioned those. Of course, it's a very difficult moment in any kind of political dynasty, the transition from the first person in the dynasty to the second person in the dynasty, because many people may have doubts about having a dynasty in the first place. Because when it's just the first king and the second king, some people say, well, should we have the dynasty as a matter of fact? Could we just elect someone else? So a lot of effort goes into convincing everyone that things are exactly like they're supposed to be. And some rhetoric and religion are always helpful. In this case, this is the first king, and he's the dying son. And this is the second king, and he is the son renewed. And they all sit on the places of the dying son and the son that is born. In the center of the universe, of course, the cruciform shape. And there are several big stucco facades celebrating the same theme on the central shrines of the city. So this is the rhetoric of the king as the son. And of course, even casual changes through the year, we know from a lintel like this one, they are reenacted by members of the court. They're all participating. Without them, say, the days cannot get longer after the spring equinox. All of these things are seen as something that is facilitated by ritual action, where impersonators, where people concurrent with the deities, essentially act upon the requirements of time, what has to be done. Gods have to be happy. The term that classic period inscriptions use is mihich, literally means to grow. And we know, say, in present-day Chorti, that's how they describe happiness, when your heart grows from happiness, presumably. So enlivening may be one way of describing it. So this monument, for example, the king is dressed as one of the guardian gods of the valley, the lord of the Macaw mountain. You can see huge macaws and mountain signs on either side. But the text says, Mihyol chanalkuch, Mihyol kabalkuch, Mihyol huntayal chanahal. Initially, people thought that it meant no hearts. So it's like things didn't go well, so gods didn't get hearts. In fact, it doesn't even talk about sacrifice. It actually talks about happiness. So the hearts of the celestial gods are growing, presumably from happiness. The hearts of the terrestrial gods are growing. The hearts of the star gods, those who burn in the sky, are growing. So they're all very happy. In this text, it's the hearts grow in the sky, earth, and caves for 5 20-year cycles. And then it shall happen, the completion of the 10 Bactons. So they're also referring to that date in 830 AD. But in this case, they say between now and then, there'll be like 5 20-year periods of happiness. In fact, the king was assassinated by his distant cousin a few years after he commissioned that elder. So, the difference between politics and reality, not everyone was happy, apparently, it turns out. But that's, that happens. So prophecies are also part of that. Remember, this notion of 20-year cycles and prophecies is also a very respectful way of saying no. You may remember when Cortez traveled through the kingdom of Itza, he tried to convince its ruler, Canek, of converting to Christianity, to which Canek politely replied that he's 100% for Christianity. He wants to, he wants use in his life any time of the year, except not in this 20-year cycle. So please come back 20 years later. We're 100% for conversion. Thank you, bye. And we know that their neighbors actually even helped building the bridge and then disassembled the bridge after the Cortez, just in case. So as far as, he was on his way to Honduras, and I'm sure Canek secretly helped that would be pretty much a one-way trip. But we do have prophecies, and it's interesting. This is colonial period text. Below you have, on top of you have a classic period text. Below you have a colonial period text. It's the cartoon of Tenahau, the 12th cartoon. It's not a good cartoon. So the classic period text says, it was the 12th cartoon, Nishana Pakal, Holy Bakal Lord had overseen it. Death Lord became the ruler. Obviously not a good sign. It was the time of death. The tree of jewels dried. Lords of the east fell, lords of the west fell. Quite obvious. Books of Chalam Balam. The cartoon established at Chablé. The letter is set up over the rulers of the land. The hoofs shall burn, the sand by the seashore shall burn, the bird's nest shall burn, the rocks shall crack with the heat. Drought is the charge of the cartoon. And it's interesting because, as I mentioned, Maya priests and historians would collect these prophecies. So towards the end, there'll be like a list of things, confirmed things, proven things. So someone from, say, 15th or 16th century Maya university would collect these references and say, that's a definite proof that this is a really bad cartoon. There's evidence, hard evidence, collected by generations of Maya scholars. And this is the so-called cartoon wheel, a representation of the system of 13 cartoons, 260 years in total. That's from the colonial period manuscript. This is an image of that, like a turtle, the surface of the earth, and 13 ahau days of the cartoons. This is a reference to the system, the emergence of the system, once again in the books of Chalam Balam. The 13 20-year cycles and their rulers. There's also the notion that every 20 years, the center of power moves between different Maya cities. Kind of a native way of explaining why fortunes of kingdoms rise and fall over time. This is from one of the Spanish priests who tried to explain the indigenous system he claimed he understood. Once again, describing the cycle of 13 cartoons. It's interesting, in the classic period times, we have representations of that too. This is Altar de los Reyes. It actually shows 13 dynasties in a circle, the same way, like the 13 kingdoms of the 13 20-year cycles. It's interesting, though, this area was known as 13 divisions. Here they are. So those were people who presumably believed in that kind of stuff. But everybody else did not. So the classic period beliefs are probably a bit more complex. So some people believed in those 13 cartoons, and others perhaps not as much. Say Naranjo was here and there of 7 divisions, 7 rain gods. They had something else going on. Those prophecy divisions, as you can imagine, collided with the European notions of the end of the times. Of course, late medieval Times in Europe were full of reasons for people to believe that the end of the world is coming. The Crusades, the wars, the Black Death. So from time to time, people would come up with grand theories of when precisely that was supposed to happen. Gioachino Fiore thought that the exact year was 1260. Obviously, it didn't happen on 1260, but the idea, the theory sort of remained. When the Europeans discovered the New World, there was a very strong millenarian message to that. Imagine, suddenly you have two new continents full of people who have to be converted. That's a sign, that's a message that God sends to people that the end of days is coming. He allows them to convert these people before it's too late. And so you have all these Christian missionaries and officials traveling to the New World thinking it's now or never. Have these massive efforts to convert people by force if necessary, right? These massive open-air churches, this is how it was done. Because these communities congregated, as they would put it, or concentrated, quite often not willingly, and priests stand in the so-called open-ended churches, big open-air lecture spaces in front of huge pictures of, well, hell mostly, that tend to impress people, and urging them to convert to Christianity. This is one of these churches from Mani, a walled space, and that's where a priest would stand in front of these big posters, the original PowerPoint presentations, and basically describe what happens to people who don't embrace Jesus early enough. But it's also important to remember, for Mayas, it did look like the end of days. Imagine us being hit by coronavirus, and within the first year, half of Tuscaloosa is dead. Within 50 years of the Spanish conquest, at least 20 million people were dead. More than 90% of the population. So imagine that 40 years from now, Alabama is mostly empty. The survivors live in Birmingham, and they're all Jehovah's Witnesses or something. Like one of the millenarian churches, right? Believing that the end is coming because everything around them is pretty much a living proof of that. And so this is the time when these notions of the end of the world kind of merge with the Maya notions of Katun prophecies, because people see on the ground, this is what is happening. The world is ending. Everyone is dead. Millions of people are dead. The whole land is empty because there's just no one to live in it. And so in the early colonial manuscript, we see this merge of the Katun prophecies. So that Katun, when things are burning from drought, when lords of east and west fall, that's when Christianity arrives. That makes total sense, right? It's also a way for people to kind of understand, to explain things which are otherwise very hard to explain, right? How can millions of people just die? How can the ways of life change so drastically and so quickly? And so, well, those powerful fellas from the other side of the sea, they say, well, that's because the world is ending, and everybody, oh, yeah, totally makes sense. It is ending. Well, our prophecies say something along those lines, too. It was about Katun anyway. So you have this merging of the two themes. But it's also important that along with this millenarian trend, there is a very powerful message in this Maya notion of time that basically because Maya tradition already has prophecies, and because Christianity promises a more egalitarian, better world, these two things are not mutually exclusive. When Jesus does his second coming, he shall descend to level all the world, for the good and the bad, the conquerors and the captives. So those millenarian ideas, they also become the very core of Maya resistance to colonial rule. When Maya in Yucatan rise against the Spaniards in the mid-19th century, it is those millenarian ideas that drive them. The talking crosses of the Cruzop, of the Republic of Chan Santa Cruz, are the spiritual leaders of the rebellion. I currently work here around Lake Bacalar, site of Tsibanche. This is now part of the story. I have people who remember, whose great-grandparents fought in that rebellion. The Mexican government apologized for the first time of the genocide of my people during the Crusoe Rebellion this year. Didn't do it before. And so that is also millenarianism, this notion that a better world is coming, as predicted by Christianity, but also by the native Maya religion. And of course, those talking crosses are the world trees of Maya New Year rituals. They're called the ches, the trees. They're dressed with mirrors and wipilis. So this message of change, the Christian message, essentially becomes the Maya message of basically fighting for equality, fighting for protecting their way of life in the face of the colonial regimes and basically modern day regimes which are no better. So and that's all I wanted to talk when it comes to my time. Remember, numerology, not astrology. These grand cycles of time, this notion of time that's something gathered. Of course, the importance of rulers eventually. It's those who gather time. It's not something that emerges outright, but eventually they place themselves at the heart of time rituals. And that is associated with the monuments and the altars, impersonation of gods, and various rituals aimed to renew the universe that now the kings monopolize. And then the prophecies, something that is still very much part of the Maya culture today, and the Christian and indigenous amalgam of these beliefs.